Our meeting will be recorded. It is a part of the Open Voice Network. We will begin and end at our scheduled time. It will be conducted according to the antitrust guidelines of the Linux Foundation. There's a link down below. And it will be recorded and stored on the OVON Google G Suite share drive. I have to get a new slide for that. So we shall dive right in. We have a couple updates, and then I just realized helps. You got bad help. That was me. We have Rebecca and Diana here with their going to be talking about their book, Conversations with Things, but other things as well. They are experts at conversation design, and so it should be a great discussion. And then we'll talk a little bit about upcoming meetings. So quick update is an important vocabulary change. We now are referring to the Open Voice Network's acronym as OVON. There was another organization within the Linux Foundation that had owned the acronym OVN. So after first mentions in reference, we can say OVON as in the Open Voice Network. And then I also wanted to just share, there are 3 new communities that are going to be starting. One will be focusing on synthetic voice, all of the legal aspects and pieces to that. There's an introductory meeting next week. And then the Open Voice Network, health and wellness industry, and media and entertainment are the week after next. And so if you'd like to be included, please let John know. And then without further ado, I want to dive into our guest speakers, because that's probably the best part of this meeting. I'm gonna be honest. I'm really excited for this. So Diana Diebel and Rebecca Evanhoe are co-authors of Conversations with Things. That is their book right there. And as part of today, we're actually going to be giving away 2 copies of this book. And there's also a discount a code that was included in the invite that is good through August 31st if you want to give a friend a copy after you've read this amazing book, because there's a lot of great insights in it. Just a little bit about Diana and Rebecca is in here. I'm not going to read this out because we're all adults, but as I had said, both Diana and Rebecca are expert practitioners, not just from a strategic perspective, as well as a practitioner perspective. So they bring together the leadership roles that they have been in. Rebecca actually teaches, and both of them, notably, I've noticed, and this is part of one of the questions I want to ask later, both of them have writing in their backgrounds, fairly, incredibly accomplished, quite frankly. But both, I've known Diana actually through content strategy. Rebecca has also content strategy chops. I'm not going to gush too much more, but essentially both of them come at this from a very strategic, informed approach and have grown up through this whole time of being able to understand the implications. And it's not just about the tech, but also understanding user centricity and how is it you make this work so that we make money, but we also accomplish our users' goals. So lots of great knowledge. And in their book, they talk a lot, not just about considerations, and there are so many things in watching both of them present and write that I've learned, but it's also that whole idea of here's how you write something that is empathetic without being pointless, quite frankly, because sometimes empathy can, but also how to get the job done and make sure that there is a result and you're able to help someone. So with further ado, I just want to turn over and we were just going to have a conversation. So to get the ball rolling, I first would, I want to turn the mic over to you both and just kind of talk about what made you write this book?
Diana, I'll let you jump in since it was your idea. Oh, we can't hear you.
Could she not unmute? Right,
Can you not
second?
unmute? Huh.
You should be able to do it now.
Okay.
Sorry, there was an ambulance going by, so I muted and then I couldn't unmute. My apologies.
Awesome.
Lesson learned. Yeah, okay, we're talking about the book, sorry. How and why this came to be. I'll start and then Rebecca, please tag in. So we started this book. I started this book with the idea of honestly, somebody like just asked me, hey, why don't you write a book on this? And I thought that was a really wild idea, and like massive imposter syndrome of why would anyone want to hear anything that I have to say? And so after kind of working through that hump for a while, went through the books that existed out in the marketplace and thought, well, it's been a while since these books have been put out, and there's a gap. This was in like maybe 2019. So it had been a couple years before anything had been published, and lots had been changing. As we all know, things change almost on a weekly basis in the voice space. So I thought, well, maybe there's space to talk about things that haven't been brought up. All these books are really practical. There's not a lot of the user experience side of things brought in. And there's been a very big push in digital design to do a lot of human-centered design approach. And we haven't seen that same application for voice and conversation. So there may be some space here to kind of talk about how we apply those really great principles to this area that we all really love. And when I started thinking about that, I was thinking about who, I knew that I had an experience, but it was not a full experience. I have done mostly voice in the health tech space, and then chat more on insurance and HR, sort of like some collection of people that wanted chatbots, nothing really focused. And I thought of Rebecca, who has this incredible breadth of experience and is such a fantastic practitioner. And we also have values that lined up really well. And I think that probably segues into the focus of the book. So Rebecca, you want to take it?
Yeah, for sure. For me, I had not, I don't think I would have thought of writing a book for years and years, but Diana and I were having a call at one point, and she was like, do you want to try and write a book together? And I said, well, sure. In my mind, it's like, we'll write a proposal, we'll put it out there, it'll probably get, shot down, and then we won't have to actually write the thing. Lucky for us, our publisher did want to publish it, and then we did have to go ahead and write a whole book. But what brought Diana and I together outside of the book was just like our interest in accessibility, inclusion, diversity. And I think a lot of folks in the field have those values, but didn't see stuff about the ethical component written anywhere. I mean, there's blog posts and talks, but there wasn't a book that showed you how to weave that stuff in. There are a few little moments where that happens. Like, for example, in Kathy Pearl's book, she talks about sexual harassment of female presenting voice assistants. But so like, as we were writing this book, we wanted this human-centered angle. And a big part of that was sort of showing how ethical considerations, and I know this group is probably hip to this, ethical considerations aren't just this abstracted thing that we talk about at conferences. It's like part of the work and part of the decision making. And so that was a big thrust of the book. So we wanted it to be a how-to. Like, if you don't know much about conversation design, grab this book. It'll show you how to do it from a UX perspective. And a necessary part of that are some of these ethical considerations. And so that's, I think we accomplished it. That's what we've got in print. So would love to have other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I was gonna say, so I wanted to set the stage from that perspective, but then if there are other questions that everyone has, please raise your hand, or feel free to come in and we can start to ask. I have a million questions, but I want everyone to have an opportunity, because it isn't often you get to have two people as accomplished as Rebecca and Diana at your disposal to ask certain questions, especially about the practice of conversation design. So one of the things I did want to talk about is, I know this is a how-to, but there's discussion about process and who to work with. This is more than you guys covered off a lot. I mean, with the ethical considerations and how do you weave that into a conversation, but there's a whole other aspect to this of sort of that strategic thinking that comes to, how do I make sure that I don't get down too far a path and have found out that it's not achievable, or my stakeholders aren't supporting me and championing me? Can you talk a little bit about then how that morphed into, if you were starting from a how-to of how that's a part of it?
I think it's hard for any designer to design something without business support. Like, you can make a lot of designs, but it's very hard to get it implemented and out into the world for people to use without some sort of resource backing. It's not impossible, but it's just much more difficult. So at least in my mind, and I think for Rebecca too, that felt like kind of a necessary part to address, because you are less successful when you don't bring people along and they're not aligned with you. And so if you do need their resources to get this thing out the door, then how can we make this as easy as possible? Seems like a big part of the process.
Yeah, totally. I think the work is inherently interdisciplinary. Like, it's very unusual and maybe not possible for one person to have sort of all the expertise. So necessarily, these teams involve a lot of people. And while we were writing the book and in the years leading up to it, I was working as a consultant with businesses who brought me on as like a designer and an educator to sort of educate internally. And the things that they needed help with were, you know, how do our designers do the design stuff, and what's our process? So sort of like a lot of indicators from like some pretty big like banks and insurance companies that I was working with, that like even big places with mature UX practices didn't know what process looked like in when you're working on conversational products. And, you know, it's both the same and different. So seeing the market kind of continually ask for that was also an indicator that like, it affirmed that our UX angle was sort of something people were hungry for, and also like people just had a lot of questions about it. And of course our answer wasn't simple. It wasn't like first do this and then do this. And so we sort of were campaigning like it's iterative. You have to make time for integrating the things that you're learning through testing. And I think that's a missing part for businesses that we tried to emphasize.
Yeah. And I know you're a big proponent, Rebecca, of QA, of just
Love
QA. Like, it's not sexy, but man, if it doesn't work, it's an important part of that process. And walking with usability and quality assurance hand in hand, like of knowing that one is not the same, and making sure that you've got that sorted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely worked with a lot of companies who were like, oh, well, we have somebody to test it at the end, and that person was the QA and the usability testing and the tuning. And it was like, if you conflate these, you're actually like, my background is in my early background is in chemistry, and so I'm like really adamant on like, you design an experiment to test for the thing that you don't know, and you have to separate your variables. So that's certainly my my bias, but I definitely feel soapboxy about that.
Jon just gave us a question, and Jon, I'm just so that everyone can hear it, and so that from there, go ahead and ask away.
And with respect that I've yet to read your work and certainly intend to, and so I trust that you'll give me the ordering guidelines, give us all the ordering guidelines for your book as we conclude here. But regards to designing in ethical principles, first question of many, but did you have a kind of a prioritization or a hierarchy of ethical principles that you need to ensure that this ethical principle is designed in first, which then provides a foundation for the next one and the next one? If you could speak to your thinking on that, and again, with apologies for not having read the book.
No.
Oh yeah.
I wouldn't expect that everybody has read the book, so no worries. We don't have like a hierarchical ethical framework that we put together, mostly because we're not ethicists, we're practitioners. But what we tried to do when we were approaching is put together a framework for process that then with each step of the process, talk about the ethical considerations that have to be addressed within that step. Rebecca, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question. And I would say that like if I, yeah, it's sort of like, what's the mental model that I think is present in the book is, or like the place where the book is trying to reach people is in the beginning. So like a lot of the concepts that we introduce are new to people for the first time. So they're like a lot of people are like, people are sexually harassing chatbots. I could make like a sexist voice experience. Data, you know, how should I tell people about how their data is being used? Like those sorts of questions are to this group, maybe not new, but to, you know, we noticed when we're like teaching and speaking and working with clients that a lot of people don't know about the existence of the potential, you know, issues out there. And so our first goal was to show you just how those crop up in the work. I think there is a lot of work being done by, like Diana said, by like actual ethicists. That like there's a book called Design Justice, for example. It was really informative, and there, you know, there are people who like study this for their lifetimes, and so I don't think we actually, like I myself don't have such a framework. More a good starting place for people, and then you know, in a couple of years, we might as a field have more of those in place, in part through like OVON's work.
What we did try to do just as like a starting place though, is this one came up for us so often in our work, was create a framework for personality, because that's where a lot of those, like Rebecca was saying, like creating a sex experience, a racist experience, a lot of that can come from the personality design. Clearly not everything, but that's where we started with our framework, because we felt like we had enough expertise and enough history to pull from on how to create something that is devoid of demographics, which helps create something that is a little bit more ethical and a little bit more inclusive, because you're focusing on behavioral aspects as opposed to demographic aspects.
It's really
Baby steps.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's important to recognize that they are baby steps, and also to try to bake it in at the very inception of a project, whether it's the use case or the beginning, in the initial conversations about what we could even do, because then that trickles through the entire process, and that gets baked into the overall design and approach. And it's nice to know that there are people kind of, you know, looking at that type of an aspect, because like Susan likes to say, in the early days of the web, we used to go, hey, did you know if we put this form together this way, people would fill it out and they would give us all this information. And then later on, we realized, well, that was a dark pattern. And because it was new, we didn't know any better. Now we have this historical context and things that we did on the web and in mobile that in retrospect probably weren't best practices and probably were something that we shouldn't have been doing, but we didn't know any better. Now we do. And it's great that there's folks like yourselves, like the ethics group within the OVON, to really start to bake that into the beginning part so that we don't make those same mistakes over again.
So Kieran has a question here asking about that of, are there specific accessibility aspects which are baked into conversational design? And what are your opinions about that? Are there some aspects that you just, boom, have to have in there, or pieces from there? I know there's the do no harm is not good enough. So like, what are those things to be thinking through?
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, I would say, so with accessibility, I think the first baseline question is whether you are doing chat or voice or something multimodal, who can use that easily and who can't. So like chat, text-based works for people who have eyes and a computer and can type in some way, but they don't need to hear. So in some ways, that's like a great option for people who have all of those things, but no hearing. Or poor hearing. And then same with like something with the screen, something with voice. So figuring out like who can use this easily, who would have difficulty using this, and kind of like what other technologies would they be using at the same time.
Yeah, Alana Mir of Facebook, she and I used to work together, and the question that we would constantly pose to each other for that is, who are we leaving out? Why? And are we okay with that? So we would constantly just be asking each other so that we knew that, like, okay, we know that this is going to be a voice only interaction. We might be leaving out people that have trouble hearing. that have different kinds of speech patterns that the ASR might not recognize, that we might be leaving out people that have cognitive issues and things like dementia, where they can't necessarily follow along in this ethereal space. Are we okay with that? Is that the population that we're trying to serve? Is that part of the population we're trying to serve? If they're not, if this is for like young children with, actually I shouldn't even say young children because they have cognitive issues too following along. So really, that's probably not a great example. Don't do it.
Well, yeah, and to that point, Jim was just asking, do you have like a scenario you can kind of walk through to kind of explain a little bit of a more concrete example? I hate to put you on the spot, but is there anything you can share?
Well, I think like thinking of somebody like with dementia, for example, because I've definitely done some design work in that space. And that's one where multimodal was crucial. Like we couldn't just have the voice only because it was just gone in a second. And for people with dementia style concerns, you've got to have repetition. You've got to have placement in both a visual and an oral context, because it's been proven that people learn better when they have both oral and visual put together. So if you've got any sort of learning concern, then you're going to have to put all hands on deck to get that message across. Rebecca, do you have any that you would call out?
Yeah, there's a quick note that I want to make. Microsoft has really good accessibility toolkit that you can adapt to voice and chat stuff. That's really well developed. And for example, like the group Voice Tech Global teaches a course that uses that framework for voice. And the actual activities you would do is like make a matrix and walk through different senses afforded to people and where your interaction might have issues or need solutions. And then there's other things you can do, like try your chatbot using a screen reader, or try your voice experience using text only. So there are sort of like experiential things that your team can do. But to kind of bop back to Jim's question, which I think he brought up kind of a little bit earlier when we were talking about just general like ethics and design decision stuff. In the book, we have an example about like, the question, like, how could a voice bot's personality be problematic or sexist or racist? We describe an example of a bot that a company that one of us worked with, we keep it a little vague so we don't reveal the source, but a company was trying to make a chatbot that it was like a group of people who were not of the ethnic group. We're trying to make a chatbot for a specific ethnic group, and they gave it a stereotypical name. They gave it sort of stereotypical
demographic qualities.
Yeah, and then also like if you take that further, so like the personality could contain like stereotypical representations. Mm-hmm. And if that bot isn't actually speaking in the right, not just language, but accents to that specific group, that can be problematic. And if it's not trained on the language patterns of that group and like the accent of the group you're trying to reach, then it could actually like not function well for the people that you're trying to reach. So things like that can introduce bias where the experience either offends the people it's trying to reach or simply doesn't work well for the people it's trying to reach.
There's, just to get like even more concrete, there was a specific chatbot that I used that I cannot remember now which group it was, but it was some like second tier baseball league that had a chatbot, and they had one in English and one in Spanish. And the Spanish one was kind of a mess. And it didn't have all the features that the English language one had. So already there was a disparity between people being served in Spanish versus people being served in English. And then the one in Spanish, it was very clear that somebody did not have a good grasp on the language because it kept vacillating between tú and usted, which in Spanish is the informal and formal. So in terms of where the bot was placed in the relationship with the user was going all over the place, which could get offensive because there's a sign of respect with using usted, and there is a sign of familiarity and friendliness that happens with tu. So it's like, well, which one are you? How am I supposed to respond to you? What do you think of me? Why are you now speaking to me as tu when you had been speaking to me as usted? And there are these sort of, that's like very basic level, because then there's also, like Rebecca's pointing out, different language patterns, different words. This is like notorious in Spanish, that across Latin America, we have similar words that are like the same word, but they have different meaning depending on the country that you're coming from. So a word that might mean like, I'm trying to think, there was one that was like Colombia, something like balloon in one language means like condom in another. So like, you know, just things like that that are gonna, depending on who you're speaking with, might really offend somebody or just confuse them at best.
Yeah. And well, and that's kind of that whole discussion about translation is localization. And using we all know Google Translator cannot be trusted, but B, we also know that we need to think not just about, hey, I'm changing these words to mean the same thing I think they mean, but thinking about that context and the cultural relevance in those pieces. It does sound, you know, when we're talking about this, we've been talking quite a bit now, and this is awesome, about just the persona of our user. We haven't even started to even design a flow or even think about any of that stuff. Like, it's having that thought through now before you even start to put things even down into how am I even going to speak to them, or like, what are the actual words? So a question I have for you though is, so we've talked about these challenges. How do you get at that language? How do you get at that? I mean, is it, hey, I need to pull in more people, or are there some ways that are, or things that you've done that have helped you avoid some of those things, or at least know that you're doing taking a better step forward?
Yeah, I think the two categories are like, one, have someone on the team who's designing or writing or consulting who is from that culture or speaks that language and that dialect fluently, who can give that firsthand, experience and lived experience and expertise. So someone on the team is part one, and then part two is when you are testing, both for usability and for people's general reactions, and gathering training data and making sure that it's like accurately understanding people, transcribing them. Then you want to have a lot of testers, either, representing all different kinds of things, different ages, different accents or dialects, different, potentially like different accents in the same language. So getting diversity in testers is kind of the other big piece that's often not as invested in as it could be.
There's a methodology of doing basically like linguistic ethnographic research, where you might go into a culture or community and just kind of like listen and capture similar to what you would do for training data to make sure that you're getting sort of similar vocal patterns and speech patterns that people use. There's some controversy with that, as there are some ethical considerations of like, are you essentially just extracting the knowledge that you want without involving those people further on down the pathway? I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I know Andrea is very well-versed in research, so I'd be curious if she has anything more to share on this topic.
Sorry, you're gonna have to repeat which topic, because I literally just walked away for 2 minutes right as I got back. Of course.
So this is on, and if you want to repeat the question, Susan, I will paraphrase, but help me. This is basically on how do you make sure that you're getting accurate representation in the speech patterns and vocal patterns of people that you yourself might not be part of the group.
Oh, yes. Okay. So yeah, I think it just, again, you guys were talking about it, right, in terms of diversity of testers, right? And it's the same thing when you're collecting your data. So when we were, and I know I presented very briefly last time on Radar Pace, but when we were doing Radar Pace, we actually sent people out with an app on their phone that prompted them in situ for like, whatever they were going to go for a 20-minute run, let's say, right? And it would prompt them every 30 seconds to say something, right? So like ask about your heart rate or things like that. So all the system was doing was just prompting them to ask about things. And that was the way that we were collecting data, and we were collecting data in situ. And we made sure to send out like as many people as we could get and as a diverse of a population as we could get out to actually collect that data. So it's about making sure that when you're collecting your data, I think you're doing the same thing as you're doing with your tester base, right? Is just ensuring that you're getting that diversity of people, that you're getting people from different backgrounds, different like racial, socioeconomic, gender backgrounds, et cetera, right? And being able to integrate that into your models. Also, I do want to say though that like I feel like no matter how good we are about that, we are still going to miss populations. So it's also really, really important for AI models to start to be able to adapt to individuals to actually help with that issue. Anyway, so that's a different point, but.
Awesome, thank you, Andrea.
And that's like another, I mean, this is a little meatier question is like, is that, how do you, I mean, you were just talking earlier about, hey, if this audience can't be here, are we okay with that? How do you reconcile that from that perspective? Or tell you what, this actually isn't our audience. Was it the most painful thing I've ever heard is edge cases define how much you care, is one of the UX axioms that has often been sent my way. But it is understanding, how do you put those limits down? And how do you think through that? And then how do you still sleep at night? Because we want everyone to be able to use our stuff, right? So like how do you guys reconcile that? How do you do that? A hard one.
No, woof.
Microsoft. I mean, personally, like I personally don't involve myself with projects that don't care and don't invest. And you know that's one of the benefits of being working for yourself, is that you get to choose. But you know that doesn't mean that unethical teams aren't happening everywhere. That just means like I'm not involved, which you know people could push against that. But Microsoft's ethical framework, their accessibility toolkit has this idea of like a pyramid where most people should be able to use the product very easily. You want to make sure that more people could use the product maybe with some modification or some additional energy input. And then there might be a small group of people for that the product isn't a fit for or isn't able to meet their needs, and they would just have to meet their needs another way. So, you know, some people can use an escalator easily, some people can use an escalator with assistance, and some people need an elevator, like that kind of concept. I think people, if you think about those sort of three tiers, people leave out the middle one where they don't take time to be like, okay, well, if someone is using a different set of technologies, trying to access our product, or like, what are accommodations? Like, how could our chatbot be better used by someone with a screen reader, for example? People don't spend a lot of time in that middle space expanding. And so to me, that's like where my focus is, so that I can, then we're at least doing something, then we're at least like truly becoming more inclusive through better accessibility.
I think given the companies that I work with, I usually tend to work with really big, like either national or international companies. So they have a lot of resources and they're usually well established. We occasionally work with startups, but I think I have the privilege of, it is rare that I'm rolling into a project where nothing exists. Like, even if it's not a very robust omni-channel experience, there's usually a channel, and this chatbot or this voice bot is going to be in addition to that. So that is a really, it's not easy necessarily because it's another team to involve, it's another budget to involve often, but it's something that we can make easier recommendations on than like, well, you can't just make an MVP of this because you're not going to be serving people. It's, well, you can make an MVP of this, we will make a roadmap. And in the meantime, you're going to serve all these other people by making these adjustments to this other channel that you have, maybe a website or an app or something else. And we will figure out a bridge so that people know that they can get served in either channel. And we're actually making this more accessible for your customers. So that's kind of like a compromise that helps me sleep at night. It's certainly still like, I think we all want to make make everything great out of the gate. But I think also as being conversation designers, we all kind of know that you got to start small with scope. And sometimes businesses can interpret that as scope of population. So that's another kind of lever we can pull is, well, let's just keep the topic area smaller, the intent area small, and then we can serve more people with a smaller group of things, figure out who this really is resonating with in this particular channel, and then go from there, because that gives us better understanding as well.
I'm curious from your perspective, what's one thing that we take for granted on the UX side of the world that conversation designers maybe don't know or haven't really implemented yet? And it could be anything, design thinking, testing, like research, like whatever, like just really curious, like what's something that we really, as, you know, established practitioners that have been doing things for a while, take for granted that we can't even think. And it's because we're so far in our careers that it's hard for us to fathom that someone's missing like this really important thing. To really help that community grow and understand, you know, we've gone through all these trials and tribulations before. Let's help you not make the same mistakes that we did early in our careers. Sorry.
Do you want to start?
No, yeah. The first thing that comes to mind for me is sort of like the reason why I'm a self-taught UX person. And the reason that I ended up in that space is because, and I think this happens to a lot of conversation people, they have some background, some interest, and they end up involved in a conversational technology product. And so it takes a while to figure out the interplay between things like training data and the prompts and how to get those working really well together. Sort of figuring out things like the personality, how the screen and the voice work together, like sort of the figuring out the experience itself. And then kind of realizing that you designed a thing based on specifications that someone told you, but then realizing that like actually the use case itself is not a good one and not viable. I think a lot of designers are sort of brought on, like told like design this thing, and you do. And then you realize like, oh, this product really doesn't need to exist, or this product is missing the point, and it's, you know, people are going to have different ideas about it than what it's actually doing, that kind of thing. And that is like, I learned all the nuts and bolts, like how do you write and how do you do training data stuff, which, you know, kind of like in the lab. And then seeing a product that I worked on go live and like have all these like pretty severe issues with users made me realize like, oh, we weren't asking some of these foundational questions. What are people really trying to do? You know, there was a real fail fast mentality, and like fail indeed, you know, we did. And so to me, it's like the spending time figuring out if the use case and the feature set the business is investing in is actually going to provide success. And you can form nicely informed hypotheses about that stuff before you start investing in expensive, code writing and production. So that's my thing. Diana, what's your thing?
I agree with you that I think like what it boils down to is like process, right? There is a process that UX design goes through that conversation design is like just now kind of starting to like figure out and label. And it's basically the same process. It's not really that different, but I think it's just been assumed, like it's just more mature on the UX side than it has been implemented in a lot of places on conversation design. And that piece that Rebecca's talking about, like the design rationale and having that practiced arm towards questioning things and providing reasons for why you're making a decision versus not a decision is not something, I think, because there are a lot of people coming from writing or from development where it's not necessarily encouraged as much to question those types of decisions. Whereas like in UX, I know you're going to fight with me on this, Rebecca. But what I'm saying is like, you're not asked to back up every decision that you make when you're writing a piece of fiction or even necessarily like a journalistic article. You are maybe questioned about how you're framing it, but not necessarily why you're choosing to write on that topic. It's usually been assigned to you and then you're taking that and executing on it. So I think like that muscle is something that takes some time to strengthen. And when it's not expected or encouraged of you at every step along the way it is, I would argue, with a lot of digital design, then it's harder to get there as quickly as the UX practitioners have gotten.
Yeah, I love that, because like why is such a critical question to ask for everything. Why are we building this? Is this the right audience? Is this the right use case? Is this the right technology? Just answering those basic questions will save you so much heartache down the road. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, and the the like finger in the air that I had, I'm yes-anding everything Diana said, but I think a lot of times the problem comes from not the practitioner's approach, but the business. Like I've worked with businesses who are like, hey, you're the designer consultant, so you're here, and we figured out the requirements by talking to the business leads. So we talked to 4 people in different areas of the business, and they made a list of all the features that it should have. And of course, that perspective, we need that perspective, but that's not the full set of information that you need. So a lot of businesses are like, oh, we figure out the what, and then a designer does the how. But if you, there's like a lot of crappy business process, and I have a lot of personal opinions about where that comes from. But so I do think that a lot of the burnout and the frustration of people in the field comes from like being asked to build things that are never actually going to solve the problem, and not having the opportunity to ask that why, or to help people understand there is more we need to learn before we know how to make this successful. And a great example of this is I'm a conversation designer. So I come to a business, they already know they want to build a voice experience or a chatbot, or something that's talking to us. And a lot of times they'll find out their problem, and it's usually our call center gets too much volume. And so we need a chatbot to sort of siphon off some excess. And I look at their website and I'm like, people are going to call you less if you fix this website. Don't make a chatbot, make a website people can navigate that. And that's how you get your call center, So that's a good example of not looking to the root cause and sort of building something that may or may not need to exist. Or
in Susan's case, she had a client suggest that you just remove the phone number from the website, and then they can't call the call center.
Yeah.
Well, that's helpful.
That wasn't even a client. That was in my corporate days, and having to go basically dive for the mute, swear a lot, then get back on and then calmly explain how that is not a viable option. But yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Interesting.
So I have one question, then Karen has one, but I'm going to have Karen ask but there is a segue of where you're talking about the role of a conversation designer. And there are times when I will, full disclosure, I did let them know, I let Diana and Rebecca know I was going to ask this question, because I think it's an important one. Is I've seen some job descriptions for conversation designers where I'm like, that's amazing. You're asking this person to have 4 different jobs. Gosh, I hope the salary is commiserate. But more so than that, there's so much to know in the craft of writing and the craft of these other pieces. What are those boundaries? So that's one question. So I'll put a pin on that. But then Kieran's asking, is there a specific design consideration based on age groups? For example, are there different, what are those different guardrails you put on for if you're developing a bot that serves seniors? I know Heidi Culberson does an interesting workshop where she has people put on dark glasses to understand if you have macular degeneration, or headphones to understand if you have a hearing impairment, things like that. But are there other guidelines of ways to look at that? Because I mean, those are super clever and it's great. But if you haven't been in Heidi's class, in one of her workshops, how do you go down that path, from there?
Sorry, I'll start, and then Rebecca, you jump in. So I think I love what Heidi does, and I think she's so smart. And I have not worked enough with young children to know about guardrails for them. But I do know, I remember we talked to Phoebe and Michael from Woozy in the Netherlands. They do sonic branding, and they were telling us about teenagers and how how it was very similar to like everything that we've talked about with getting different speech patterns, getting different users who aren't necessarily like you, and that they did a lot of work there to inform what their personality should be, because we were talking in the context of personality. The things that I remember them coming out with, and I hope I'm not misquoting them here. There was a resistance, probably unsurprisingly, to authority, or to like feeling overly formal, that when they put that next to people who are like more in their 50s, that felt more comfortable for them. So I think like I wouldn't take those as best practices to lay across everybody, but what I would say is, wow, that was a finding that they wouldn't have known if they hadn't have gone and talked to their user base. And so that is probably the guardrails that I would put up there. And then Rebecca's putting in the Microsoft stuff.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think it's like for that stuff, it's like assume that you know very little about what people want. I think that's a great place to start. Actually, it's tricky because a lot of people think that designers are the people who are supposed to sort of stand in for others with their design knowledge. But like, as you can tell from hearing from me and Diana, we're all about process. So, always like involve the people, involve children, work with children, talk to children. That's how you learn. And I think there are good blogs and things with some like basics. So it is useful to like research, like you could talk to someone who's an elementary school teacher as a different perspective on like, what are good ways that kids learn, or what do you do if a kid is struggling to learn something their peers aren't, or what kinds, how do kids play certain kinds of games, things like that. It's useful, like, you can talk to people in addition to the kids, but I think that's just really important. And it's as simple as that, just like talk to them, do some testing with them.
Yeah.
Well, and if you serve multiple audiences with the same bot, do you have any guidance or recommendations on how to maybe change the delivery of the information so that it's more appropriate for a senior, like above 65, as opposed to like a teenager or someone in their 20s? Is there any thoughts around kind of that idea?
I think I would make sure that you know why you're doing that first and foremost, because there's I know Rebecca and I both run into this, where there's this like proliferation of personalities for a single bot. And we always make the joke of like, it should be like the Highlander. There's only one.
Love it.
Otherwise you just get like this whack-a-mole situation where people don't know what they're talking to, when or why. And so if I'm 40, so if I'm talking to a bot, I'm probably going to have one experience. My kid's 5. If I'm now listening in and trying to interact while he's guiding that experience, I might get super confused about what is happening or how I'm supposed to help him, because there's a different interaction pattern or a different, even, I don't know, like way of talking back. Where it gets to me a little clearer cut is if you're going to talk to multiple groups, focusing on the understanding piece of it. Are you accommodating the way people are trying to talk to you versus trying to change the way you're talking to them? Feels like a cleaner place to draw the line and a less confusing place to draw the line.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's really
good. And there's this idea in inclusive design and ethical design, specifically with writing, where like if you write language that uses common words that most people understand, whether English is their first language, whether it's not, whether they're a kid, whether they're someone with a literature PhD, using language in the most like common word set is not like dumbing it down, it's opening it up. And that's like, I'm quoting Sarah Winters, nay Richards, and her book Content Design talks about that concept a lot. So there is like this idea that if you make it easy for one group to understand, it benefits all groups and makes it easier for other groups too.
Yeah. And I think that's just like the two things, championing an audience doesn't mean you are that audience. I mean, and that again, I think is something that UX has been drilled into my skull of you are not the audience. And it's like, but it's moms that are, nope, you're not the audience, you know, and making sure that you remind yourself that. And yes, you might have some empathy and insights, but at the end of the day, you're still not, because of the role you are playing in the design of that product experience, what have you, you're kind of behind the curtain. But the other side of that is simplifying isn't dumbing it down. Like I know there's a big discussion about plain language. That always is floating in the content strategy world of use freaking plain language. But that doesn't mean that when you're talking to a third grade reading level, that means that they're only as smart as a third grader. Just realize that you're using a vocabulary thing to make that more accessible, not that they're dumber, you know, or not that third graders are dumb, but simply worldviews and things like that.
Yeah, that plain language thing got drilled into me working in healthcare, because there are
Yes.
doctor specialists, like a heart surgeon can't understand a neurosurgeon because they're talking about different things and they've specialized so deeply in one thing that if they use doctor speak and medicalese, they can't actually understand each other sometimes, which is just wild to me.
Like, you guys have degrees of what? But yeah, and that's an incredible example of that. Awesome. Well, so we actually only have go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, we didn't get a chance to talk about your question, Susan. It was more about like, where is the conversation designer stop and start?
Yeah.
And I think that basically like the chapters in our book, it's like prompt writing, training data and intents, personality stuff, documentation and flow diagrams, usability testing. That's all stuff that appears on the job descriptions. The most common things, like sometimes a writer specialist works on the team. Sometimes a UX person works on the team. Sometimes a linguist or data scientist kind of takes over the training data piece. And I think that like for like a small product or a new product, a lot of times a conversation designer is sort of in charge of the whole cycle. But the bigger a product, the full stack conversation designer.
Full stack
bigger products and bigger companies, you see more like stratification or more like boundaries between the roles. But I do think like at Amazon or Google, a lot of their conversation designers would be expected to do like all that stuff, which is a really big ask. And it you know, I mean, people do it. There are those full stack people, but I think that roles are maybe getting a little bit more specialized over time.
And that's something like going back to Scott's question of like, what's UX better at? Like in general, design has gotten better at like specializing and saying like, these are the boundaries of like what a UX designer does versus what a content strategist does versus what a researcher does. And conversation design is still very much like Rebecca's pointing out, like, I don't know, do it all. Why not?
Yeah, and that can feed into imposter syndrome real fast. Of like, can I call myself a conversation designer? I don't know. I can't do I'm not full stack. Wait. I love the idea of calling full stack as opposed to, I don't know, half stack, but like it kind of that idea. And that's kind of one of the support things I think in our community, we want to try to be cognizant of like not doing Dunning-Kruger, you know, shoving people down that whole path of the more you know, the more you don't think you know, but then also the little you know, the more you think you're an expert sometimes. Of like, how do you balance that to give people the confidence to be able to be like, yep, this is the path down that. But yeah.
Well, I was actually asked on a recent thing about the research, what can conversation designers do to come up with better use cases? And I actually said, in a lot of cases, bringing in other people. And it's like the early days of the web where we had developers really focusing on everything from design, content creation, development. And it wasn't until creative got involved, strategy got involved, stakeholders got involved, that the web became what it ultimately became. And so I think there's that specialization like Diana's talking about, where we need to bring in those diverse points of view and skill sets and expertise to really help, instead of forcing this one individual to do all of the things.
One caveat I'll put there is as long as they work collaboratively, because I think it's so, Rebecca and I have both been in this position where it's like, you will do this one little slice and never shall you see the beginning nor what happens afterwards. Good luck to you.
Right.
Yeah. that's the worst. It is definitely having that transparency of being able to see the things. So yeah, well, we're almost at time. So I want to be respectful of time. And again, I want to thank you both so much for coming and talking and having this conversation. The book is available. It's available on Amazon, but more importantly, it's available at Rosenfeld. It's in the invite. And I can't believe I did not put that in this slide deck. I was so focused on, yeah.
Rebecca's all, or Diana's all over it.
Diana's all over it.
Both
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. And then,
And
yes.
there's a code too that we'll drop in the chat so you can get a discount. Let me grab that.
And you can buy all the Rosenfeld books because they're incredible.
Yeah, the code works for anything on the site.
That's awesome.
Sorry, I gotta dig it up.
I know,
Yeah.
I'm trying to find it too.
Here, let me look at the invite real quick. As I open the speaker invite, which doesn't have that code in it. All right.
I'm getting close. I've got the spreadsheet.
Who's gonna win the code race?
This is, yeah, we'll see. I think it's gonna be Rebecca.
Kieran got it.
Oh, thank you.
Wow,
Nice.
the sleeper. Love it.
Out of nowhere.
Yeah.
All right, so.
Oh wait, I don't see. Did Kieran put it in the chat?
Yeah, I'm
We're gonna
actually
put it
gonna put it in right now. He
Okay.
just DM'd it to us.
Perfect. Perfect.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Kieran.
And I will send a, if you ping me and let me know. Yeah. There we go.
Oh,
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again.
Found it.
Yeah. And looking forward to just digging even more in this. I've gone through the book once. I want to, again, it's a great book. And thank you. And right now we're looking in August, we'll be sharing out some of the Voice Consumer Index research with a designer strategist spin to it. I think right now we've been doing a lot of business spins. So looking from that perspective, I'm planning to do that in August, but if depending on response, we might move that to September if people are taking August off. I'm hearing a lot of August is the vacation month. So yeah, but thank you again, everyone. And if you have any other questions, you know where to find Scott and myself. And again, thank you very much, Diana and Rebecca.
Thank you
Thank you
for
for having
us.
us.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.